Hello. Today we're going to talk about disorders of trauma and stress. Imagine being in a situation where you don't feel safe. Say you've gone out jogging at night and you're cooling down and walking back home. It's dark outside, you're by yourself, and you hear footsteps behind you and they're quickening as the person is coming closer. You look over your shoulder and you see someone whom you do not recognize. So you pick up the pace yourself and you're not feeling safe. You feel threatened and you notice certain physiological changes occurring in your body. Your heart is beating faster. Your breathing rate is quickening. Your steps are quickening. And you hurry to your home, go inside, lock the door, sit down, and eventually you start to feel more calm again. The reaction that you just had is what might be called the fight or flight response to perceived threat. And as you know, this reaction results from an activation of the autonomic nervous system. We talked about it a little bit in the chapter on anxiety disorders. But we learn in this chapter on stress, disorders of trauma and stress, that there are two systems that work when we react to threat. One is the autonomic nervous system, and the other is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that is involved with our endocrine system and stress hormones that are produced in our body. These two systems come together and interact to produce this reaction to threat that we've just described. Hopefully, you've never been in a life or death, life-threatening situation before. But if you have, you might have experienced this reaction, but much more strongly in response to something traumatic that happened to you. And as you're aware, there are various kinds of life-threatening traumas that we can experience, and they can come at us out of the blue. A car suddenly appears and crashes into the side of our car. Someone jumps us and assaults us. A first responder is in a life-threatening situation involving gunfire or a burning building, or someone who requires emergency assistance, where their life, the first responder's life, may also be in danger. A soldier is in battle, someone who's raped, someone who is in domestic violence, someone who survives a hurricane or tornado where their home is destroyed. The list goes on. And these are all situations that can produce a stress response that is referred to as either an acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. This kind of disorder can occur after some life-threatening event happens to us. Of course, everybody who experiences a trauma does not develop acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, but some of us do. And most of us will experience at least some symptoms associated with acute or post-traumatic stress disorder after something traumatic happens, even if it doesn't result in a full-blown episode. As I imagine you are aware, from your reading, or perhaps from firsthand experience, or from talking with someone else who's gone through something traumatic. When a traumatic event happens in our lives, our sense of safety and security is shattered. We no longer feel safe anymore. Most of us probably get up in the morning feeling safe and feel that way throughout the day and when we go to bed at night. But when something traumatic happens, that sense of safety um, is taken away from us, at least for a while. And that can be very disconcerting. Of course, if somebody is actually experiencing acute or post-traumatic stress symptoms, they may have bad dreams about the traumatic thing that happened to them. They may be what's called hyper-vigilant, where they're always on guard, afraid something else bad is going to happen. They may have decreased emotional responsiveness to ordinary events throughout the day. They may have flashbacks where they relive the traumatic event and re-experience feelings associated with it over and over again. These are just some of the symptoms that someone might experience if they are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you know the main difference between acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, if your thinking is that it's a matter of timing, you would be correct. In the case of acute stress disorder, the symptoms appear within a month and last no more than a month after something traumatic happens to a person. Whereas in post-traumatic stress disorder, the symptoms can appear at any time and last much longer. You may well know somebody who is or has struggled with acute or post-traumatic stress disorder. One interesting example of PTSD that comes to mind for me occurred when I was leading a group in a psychiatric hospital on a medical center campus a number of years ago. This medical center campus had a helicopter that medevac that flew people in and out in emergencies. And the helicopter flew over the psychiatric building during a group therapy session. And when it did, a member of the group dove to the floor. He was a Vietnam veteran, and the sound of the helicopter triggered his reaction. This is a kind of thing that people with PTSD can experience. We hear a fair amount about PTSD in our veterans and how hard it is for them to get the treatment that they need. We also hear about how PTSD not only affects that individual, but those around them as well, because of changes in their thinking and behavior that can result after something traumatic happens to them. So hopefully, as we learn about PTSD in this chapter and some of the ideas about causes and treatments of it, it can help us all to have more understanding and compassion for people who have experienced traumatic events in their lives. One interesting area of study with regard to PTSD is I'm looking at factors that might place some people at greater risk for developing PTSD. Everybody who experiences something traumatic in their life doesn't develop the full-blown syndrome. So researchers have tried to figure out some of the reasons for that. And as you read about the disorder in your book, you'll have a chance to look at some of that research and some of those factors. One interesting finding with regard to that area of research, I think, has to do with social support. Because it has been found that people who have a high level of social support tend to do better after something traumatic happens in their life and those who don't. There was an interesting study done in Florida a number of years ago, not in our book, but I wanted to mention it, following Hurricane Hugo, where they looked at children to try to figure out what factors might have helped buffer some of the kids anyway from developing full-blown PTSD. And indeed, they did find that social support was a very important factor. The greater the level of social support, the less severe the PTSD symptoms tended to be among the children studied. You'll also note in your reading that sociocultural factors also come into play. And I think a fascinating area there, which ties in with social support, has to do with people from Hispanic backgrounds. It's sometimes tending to be at greater risk to develop PTSD than some other groups might. And one of the ideas is that folks from that culture rely so much on their families for support, and some sorts of traumatic events, say like a tornado or hurricane or flood, can disrupt the family network, making it harder for individuals to get the support they need, and therefore possibly placing them at greater risk for developing PTSD. Another of the factors mentioned is the severity of the trauma. The greater the threat to the person, the greater the likelihood that they might develop symptoms of acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. So you have the opportunity to learn about different treatment approaches that are taken in the treatment of acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. By the way, in DSM-IV, the one that precedes DSM-V, there was not an acute stress disorder diagnosis. It was added. And the reason why it was added was to make it more possible for people to get help for themselves sooner after something traumatic happened to them. So they would have a billing code that could be used with insurance for acute stress disorder. So you wouldn't have to wait at least a month, and it wouldn't have to go on for longer than that before the person could actually get help. The type of therapy, psychological therapy, that has been found to be particularly helpful with post-traumatic stress disorder is exposure therapy. In exposure therapy, the individual is gradually exposed through discussion, through imagery, sometimes through computer technology, to the event that occurred in their life that was traumatic. And they're helped to talk about the experience, their memories about it, their feelings about it, their thoughts about it in ways that can help them to better integrate the experience so that it doesn't continue to affect them so strongly as it does when somebody is experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever we experience a stressful event in our lives, of course, there is an increase in the production of stress hormones in our body. And this occurs at the same time that our brain is trying to process the event and to help us deal with it. Well, ordinarily, when we have an experience in our lives and it's processed in our brain, eventually it's stored as a memory, and the emotions associated with the memory are stored too in an integrated kind of way. But in the case of PTSD, the biological effects on the brain are so overwhelming because of the level of stress involved that it disrupts the brain's ability to process the experience in a normal way. and to integrate the memory and the emotions together in a way that helps the memory to sort of eventually recede into the background rather than continue to erupt into the foreground of the person's consciousness, and also when they sleep. In other words, they have flashbacks and bad dreams, recurring ones. So through therapy, these different aspects of the experience, emotional, memory, cognitive, can be processed and integrated in a way that helps the memory eventually recede to the background, which is where it belongs. But people oftentimes may feel guilt, other conflicted feelings about what happened, and this process is made more complicated because of that. But exposure therapy helps them to move in that direction. As you'll see in reading about it in your textbook, there are different types of exposure therapy that might be used, but generally it has been found to be helpful. Sometimes medication is used as well, along with the psychological approach to treatment. And there are even some other psychological approaches mentioned in your chapter, but exposure therapy is really the main approach that's taken. So that's a little bit on acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. I have provided you with a powerful video of a woman's firsthand account of being in a domestic violence situation over a number of years, and how she finally overcame that situation. That video helps us to look at one particular circumstance that sometimes can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, and also explore some other important questions as well. So let's talk a little bit about dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders, also included in this chapter, are among the most fascinating yet rare disorders that we might encounter. As you're probably aware, a dissociative disorder involves a disorder that results in a dissociation or disconnection between a person's experience and their memory of that experience, but not where an injury to the brain is suspected. In other words, the disconnection between memory and experience seems to have a psychological basis to it. Now, all of us have experienced dissociation at one time or another. If you've ever driven in your car a long distance, you probably have had experiences where you might have driven through a small town and can barely remember that you did, because your mind sort of disconnects and goes elsewhere while you're behind the wheel driving. I mean, you're aware of what you're doing as far as driving the vehicle and the traffic around you, but still there's a sort of a disconnection that takes place there. Daydreaming would be another normal example of that. I like to tease my students in seated classes that I know they would never daydream in my class, that their thoughts wouldn't drift off someplace else, only in someone else's class. But of course, when that happens to us, for a little while anyway, our attention is, there's a disconnect in our attention where we're not paying attention to some things immediately going on around us because our mind is elsewhere. So in the case of dissociative disorder, that whole process is just much more pronounced, where this disconnect between memory and experience takes place. And the idea is that it often seems to have to do with a high level of stress or something traumatic that happens in a person's life. So there are three kinds of dissociation that I wanted to talk with you about: dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, and then dissociative identity disorder. So in the case of dissociative amnesia and dissociative fugue, in both of those situations, oftentimes the amnesia or fugue state arises in the context of something stressful or traumatic that happens in a person's life. And let's say with dissociative amnesia that a soldier is in battle, and following the battle, he either can't remember any of it or he can only remember parts of the experience that occurred. It was a horrific experience, and it's hard for him to recall it. So there may be a dissociation that takes place there between the event and the individual's memory of it. In the case of dissociative fugue, what happens is that there's amnesia plus flight or travel, where the person may travel sometimes a long distance from home, and they forget who they are temporarily, and where they came from, that kind of thing, people in their life. They can still remember factual information about, say, the capital of the state, or who's the president, or how to do math problems, or whatever it might be, but they have trouble remembering personal information about themselves and events in their life. In the case of fugue, which is amnesia plus flight. So I remember reading an interesting case once about this man who was a police officer, a county sheriff actually, in a small southern town. And on occasion, he would dissociate and take flight and end up in some other town, sometimes hundreds of miles away, where he lost temporarily his awareness of who he was or where he was from. And he would tend to hang out with the criminal element in that town. And then eventually he would come to, so to speak, and remember who he was and call his wife to come and get him. And she was kind of used to it. So that's what can happen with dissociative fugue. Now, with dissociative amnesia, there are different types that you'll be reading about in your book, and I wanted to talk about them just a little bit. One is called localized dissociative amnesia. This is really the most common type of dissociative amnesia, and this is when a person cannot remember a traumatic event that has occurred. They can remember up to the event and then after the event, but not what happened during the event. In selective amnesia, they can remember parts of it, but not all of it. In generalized amnesia, they have trouble remembering things that happened before the event up through the event. And in continuous amnesia, they have trouble remembering all of it, plus things that have occurred after the event as well. And again, the most common type of amnesia is localized amnesia. Now, with respect to both amnesia and fugue states, it's interesting to note that oftentimes these problems correct themselves spontaneously, and that the person just comes out of the amnestic state or the fugue state without any type of therapy necessarily being required. Now, the other dissociative disorder that I wanted to talk with you about is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. This is a highly fascinating yet controversial disorder in which people end up developing more than one personality. So I've provided you with a video of Eve White and her 3 personalities, probably the most famous case of dissociative identity disorder in all of clinical literature. And you have the opportunity to actually see her switch back and forth between her three personalities that she had at the time in this video. Some people question whether or not dissociative identity disorder even exists. And then there are others who really believe that it's a thing, that it does exist, and that we need to take it seriously and provide help to people suffering from this disorder so they can get to a better place and integrate the different parts of their personality. The type of therapy that is often used in the treatment of dissociative identity disorder is one that emphasizes the development of a trusting relationship between the therapist and the client, and then a gradual process of dealing with traumatic experiences if they have occurred, and helping the different subpersonalities to gain conscious awareness of one another so that they can become integrated into a whole personality. As you can imagine, that's a very time-consuming process, and it's one that needs to be attempted only by the most skilled of therapists who have special training and experience in working with people with dissociative identity disorder. One final observation I would like to make about that disorder is that some researchers have suggested that the disorder, at least for some people, may result from something traumatic happening early in a child's life. And that through the defense mechanism of repression, the child pushes the traumatic event into the unconscious part of their mind. It's still there, it still affects them, but they're not dealing with it directly. Imagine, if you will, the sad situation of a little girl who's sexually abused when she's young. She cannot physically get out of that situation, but she can mentally escape by dissociating her mind so that she disconnects her mind from her body. And things are being done to her, but her mind is someplace else when it's happening, is a way of dealing with it. It's a very sad situation to contemplate, but some people do believe that this may be how the stage is set for the development of dissociative identity disorder, at least for some people. Again, this is controversial, and there are others who would disagree with what I just said. But if that is a way in which the stage is set, it's not hard for us to see then how there can be this fragmentation of the personality that occurs. And it makes it harder for the child to grow up and have an integrated personality because of how this dissociative process took place early in life, where they learn to disconnect their feelings from their body and their memory from their experience. I believe that's about it for this section on disorders of trauma and stress. I hope you enjoy learning about these disorders and viewing the videos that we have for this week. I'll look forward to talking with you again soon. Bye for now.